But Daniel chapter 8, so we're continuing on our Daniel series here. So last week we were in Daniel chapter 7, which we were starting off our visions. In this chapter we see that we're a little further in time. So in the first, Daniel chapter 7, remember it was in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. So we're back to where he's in Babylon or under the Babylonian rule. And then in this one it says in the third year of the reign of the king of Belshazzar. So obviously we're a couple years ahead of that last vision that he had. But in this vision, it's actually, a lot of this vision is just really self-explanatory, okay? Meaning that this is a pretty easy chapter, except for when we get to this vision of these number of days, which that's where I'm going to really getting into the meat. But let's read verse 2 here and down, dealing with this vision of the ram with two horns and the he-goat. And it says in verse 2, it says, "And I saw in a vision, and it came to pass when I saw that I was at Shushan in the palace, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in a vision, and I was by the river Ulai. Then I lifted up mine eyes and saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram which had two horns, and the two horns were high, but the one was higher than the other, and the higher came up last. I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward, so that no beasts might stand before him. Neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand. But he did according to his will and became great. And as I was considering, behold, an he-goat came from the west and on the face of the whole earth and touched not the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. And he came to the ram that had two horns, which I had seen standing before the river, and ran unto him in the fury of his power. And I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with choler against him, and smote the ram, and brake his two horns, and there was no power in the ram to stand before him. But he cast him down to the ground, and stamped upon him, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. Therefore the he-goat waxed very great, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and for it came up four notable ones toward the four winds of heaven." So this is a big portion of this vision. We're not done with the vision yet. But honestly, this is very self-explanatory because in verse 20, go down to verse 20, it explains exactly who we're talking about. And I know I already kind of covered this when I was dealing with chapter 7, and we were dealing with the bear, that beast of the bear, and then dealing with the leopard, and how those two beasts in Daniel 7 are the same as this ram and this he-goat. But notice in verse 20, because you say, well, I wonder who this is, and you're trying to figure it out, it just spells it out, okay? It's like when you're reading about the parable of the tares of the field, and it's just like, yeah, the field is the world, the reapers are the angels, and it just like spells it out for you. So in verse 20 here, it says, "The ram which thou sawest having two horns are the kings of Media and Persia. The rough goat is the king of Grecia, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. Now that being broken, whereas four stood up for it, four kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not in his power." So that's very clear, right? You have this, the ram that had the two horns is Media and Persia. Remember, the last one came up, the last one was higher. Why? Because that's the Persians. That's why the bear stood up on one side, or raised itself up on one side, because it's raising itself up on the Persian side. Okay? And then you have this rough goat that had this horn, which is the first king. Okay, so it's telling you exactly. So when you're dealing with these horns, what are you dealing with? Kings. And that's throughout the Bible prophecy. When you're dealing with horns, you're dealing with kings. It represents a crown, so to speak. So you can think of just an animal with horns. What does that kind of look like? A crown. And so when you look at this, you're dealing with the Media Persia Empire and then the Grecian Empire. And this is dealing with the first king, which I believe would be Alexander the Great. This fits perfectly with history, that this would be Alexander the Great, because he's the one that took out Persia. Okay? And then also the fact that he died young, and then his kingdom was split. Okay? And it wasn't split to the power that he had before. And so I'm going to get into this a little more detail when we get into chapter 11. Because what we're going to deal with here is something that is in history when you're dealing with the Grecian Empire. And when I preached at the post-trib conference, I kind of took this as being like this is all future events. But the name of the sermon is Daniel 8, Dual Fulfillment. Okay, meaning that when you get into this passage, you got to understand dual fulfillment. Now, I obviously believed in dual fulfillment before I preached when I went to the post-trib conference, but I wasn't really applying it as much as I should have, dealing with Daniel 8 and Daniel 11. And dual fulfillment is like when it talks about Elijah the prophet shall come before the great and notable day of the Lord, the great and terrible day of the Lord, come, and you look at the fact that John the Baptist was at Elijah to come, but we also know that Elijah is going to come, physically. Elijah the prophet's going to come as one of the two witnesses before the great and terrible day of the Lord. That's called dual fulfillment, meaning that you have kind of like a shadow fulfillment, and then you have the all-out full fulfillment as far as what's going on there. So we see that a lot, and when you're dealing with prophecies in the Bible, you're dealing with dual fulfillments a lot of times. So you're dealing with, when you're in Zechariah, talking about Zerubbabel and stuff like that, and Zerubbabel, a lot of that prophecy was towards him as the governor of Judah and Jerusalem during, when they rebuilt the temple, but it was also a picture of Christ. And talked about Zerubbabel's, talking about the stone with 7 eyes, and talking about how Zerubbabel's made a signet and Haggai, but it's really picturing Christ. Okay, same thing with Joshua the high priest, right, and Zechariah. So there's a lot of this, especially in the minor prophets, but in the prophets as well, is you'll see something that's immediate future, or something that's in a closer proximity in the future, and then something that comes way after that's another fulfillment of it, okay? And that's what we see here, and I'm going to get into that a little more when we're dealing with this little horn. But I wanted to explain what's going on. If you just looked at history, and I've been reading a lot of history about this, okay? Now, I read, when it comes to the abomination of desolation, I read the Maccabees, where it talks about Antiochus Epiphanes, but before you get to that and just the history that's around that, is that just the history of what happened after Alexander the Great died, okay? And what you find is that it basically came in the 4 big kingdoms, okay, which is what it's saying here, right? It's basically saying the first king dies, and then there's 4 kingdoms to the 4 winds. And there's 2 major kingdoms, so there's 4, but then there's others too. So it's not just 4, like if you're looking up the history on this, meaning that there's other little pieces and parts and stuff like that. But there's 4 major ones, okay? And it's dealing with generals or officers that Alexander the Great had. And there's basically the Ptolemy Empire that came out that was on the south end, where Egypt, he basically became like the king of Egypt, and that's where Alexandria, Egypt, became the capital of that empire, okay? So you think of Cairo as like the capital, I think, now of Egypt. And back in, obviously back in Moses' day, it was another city and stuff like that. But Alexandria, we see in the New Testament talked about. But Alexandria, Egypt, becomes the capital, and Ptolemy was one of his generals, okay? He had another general, which was, and I'm going to maybe mispronounce this, but Seleucus, or Seleucus, or however you would say that, but we would call it the Seleucid Empire, okay? The Seleucid Empire was basically taking over all of Babylonia and Persia, okay? So this was kind of the big power. If you're going to look at the 2 big ones out of those 4 kingdoms, was the Seleucid, which was basically north of Israel, and then you had the Ptolemy Empire, which was south of Israel. Now, this is where I believe when you get into Daniel 11, which we'll get into, not tonight, you're dealing with the king of the north, king of the south. And you're dealing with those 2 kingdoms, okay? It just happens to be that Israel's in between there, so when it's saying king of the north, it's north of Jerusalem. When you're dealing with the king of the south, it's actually south of Israel. But it's really, if you're looking at a map as far as this kingdom, it's really north and south, okay? And so, that being said, there's a lot to be said about the Seleucid, the king of the north, is where this king of fierce countenance comes out of. And that's where you get into the idea of Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, to say this, there's no doubt that Antiochus Epiphanes was a man, and he was a king, meaning that he's on money. Like, they found money with his name on it, okay? And now, when you go into like the Apocrypha and you're looking at the Maccabees, you got to take all that stuff with a grain of salt. Meaning this, the Apocrypha, with the Maccabees was written after this happened. Therefore, they could have very well just pretty much broke down what Daniel was saying. Does that make sense? Because it's pretty much just spelling out what Daniel says. So when you read it and you're like, that's exactly what Daniel says. It's talking about the abomination of desolation. It talks about like how he does all this other stuff. But there's other history, like other people that would say otherwise. All I'm saying with this is that this little horn that comes out here in chapter 8 is coming out of the Grecian Empire. But we also see that in chapter 7, the little horn came out of the fourth kingdom, which would have been the Roman Empire, or out of those 10 horns that came out of the Roman Empire. And so what I believe you're seeing here is a dual fulfillment, meaning that there's two separate events that are pretty much paralleling each other. So what I believe about this, when you read Daniel chapter 8 and you read Daniel chapter 11, it's something that had already happened, but it's going to happen again. Okay, so that's the way I read it, meaning that everything in Daniel chapter 8 will pertain to end times prophecy, but it also pertained back then. Okay, and then there's stuff in Daniel 11 that pertained to back then, but it's also going to pertain to end times prophecy. Okay, because when I was looking at this, back in the past and looking at this, I'm always looking for where's that break off where it's going from what happened in the past and where it starts going into the future. That's a problem because there's no real break-off point where you're just like, all right, here's where we start into end times, where we're talking about like the future, after Christ, all that stuff, right? After Christ rose from the dead. There's no real good break-off point. It just seems like this is definitely end time stuff, but you didn't see where it switched. Well, what you're dealing with is the fact that it's talking about something that already happened, but that's going to happen again. And proof that it's going to happen again is because Jesus said, when you see the abomination spoken of by Daniel the prophet, that it doesn't matter if you're a preterist, which I'm going to get into, because preterism's wrong. If you were a preterist, that's still after the Grecian Empire. Does that make sense? So either way you slice this, there's an abomination of desolation that happens after the Grecian Empire. Does that make sense? And so I think for this to make perfect sense is that when you look at this as a dual aspect, meaning this happened back in the at the end of the Grecian Empire, but then it's going to happen again in the future. Okay? And so there's this little horn that was there, this kind of Antichrist type of figure, but there's also going to be the Antichrist that comes in the end. So this is kind of a shadow, if you want to look at it as a shadow fulfillment, and then there's going to be a true fulfillment when you have the Antichrist and, what's going to happen at the end times, okay? Now going to Daniel chapter 8, and I hope this makes sense, and I'm going to be getting in more detail when we get into as we go through the chapters here. So this isn't the only time I'm going to be talking about this, but I think that'll help you make sense of it. Because when you're reading chapter 7, chapter 8, you're like, wait a minute, the little horn's coming out of a different kingdom, okay? And so that can be confusing. In chapter 8, verse 9, it says, and out of one of them came forth a little horn. So out of what? One of those 4 kingdoms, right? One of those 4 kingdoms that was broken up. There came out a little horn, which waxed exceeding great toward the south and toward the east and toward the pleasant land. Now, first of all, when you see the term pleasant land or glorious land, that's talking about Jerusalem. That's talking about Israel, okay? The problem is people are like, oh, that's America. No, what you got to understand is that in the Bible, everything's basically, if you're saying, well, it's in the east, north, whatever, it's always, Jerusalem's kind of like that. Like if you're on a GPS, looking at it, your point of where you're at would be in Jerusalem, okay? So when it says north, south, east, west, it's usually predicated off that. And so the pleasant land, I believe, is talking about Jerusalem. In verse 8, it says, and it waxed great even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground and stamped upon them. Yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host. And by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down, and an host was given him against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression, and it cast down the truth to the ground and practiced and prospered. So I'm going to kind of break this down, but first I want you to see that this, like I said, the little horn that we see here is coming out of the Grecian Empire, right? That he-goat. The he-goat that had 1 horn that was broken, and then 4 came up after that, and then it says that out of one of those came forth this little horn, which if you look at history, and if you're going to take history, and again, take it with a grain of salt, right? I'm not saying that's scripture, but Antiochus Epiphanes came out of the Seleucid Empire, which was the kingdom of the north, which is what we see in Daniel chapter 11, okay? But just to show you, when it says, go back to Daniel chapter 7, just so you see that the little horn that's spoken of in Daniel 7 is no doubt talking about the Antichrist in the future. So when you're in Daniel 7, you're dealing with that little horn, that's future. That's not talking about the Grecian Empire. That's clearly coming out of that last kingdom right? You had the fourth kingdom upon the earth, which would be the Roman Empire, and then out of that kingdom came forth these 10 horns, and out of those 10 horns came forth this little horn. And notice in at the end of verse 7, you see it had 10 horns, talking about that fourth beast. In verse 8, it says, I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another little horn, before whom there were 3 of the first horns plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. So, and here you're dealing with 10 horns. Out of that came out a little horn. In chapter 8, you're dealing with 4 horns. Out of one came a little horn. Okay? But that's where you get that dual aspect as far as that goes. But I want you to see that, go to Daniel chapter 2 and verse 44. When you're dealing with the 10 horns, you're dealing with the end of the world. Okay? No doubt, when you're dealing with those 10 horns, when you see those 10 horns, that's end of the world. That's not something that has already happened. Notice in Daniel 2 and verse 44, and for sake of time, I'm not going through that whole thing, but we're talking about those 10 toes of that image that he saw. It says in verse 44, and in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom, which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. So that little horn that's coming out of the 10 horns in chapter 7 is clearly talking about the Antichrist that's going to be in the day when God sets up his kingdom that's never going to end. Okay? So that is not talking about the Grecian Empire at all. And obviously that makes sense because the Grecian Empire was the leopard, which was behind that fourth beast, and then the fourth beast had 10 horns and all that. And I know this is deep, okay? I know this is not, milk of the word, but again, when we're going through this, you got to dig in. And going back to chapter 8, like I said, chapter 8's dealing with the Grecian Empire, but it's interesting that it parallels. And listen, how many times have we seen parallels in the Bible? Allegories, parallels, things that have happened. And listen, I'm going to show you that there's even parallels with the Antichrist dealing with Nineveh and Assyria, right? And if you think about it, all those heads are a part of Babylon, right? Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Medo-Persian, Grecian, Roman, and then the last kingdom, which would be the 10 horns. So it wouldn't be that crazy to think that in the Grecian Empire there's a picture of the Antichrist, right? Because it's one of those heads of Babylon. And in Daniel chapter 8, I just kind of want to break down this vision a little bit and show you that future aspect that's in here. It says in verse 10, it says, and it waxed great, even to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and the stars to the ground and stamped upon them. Now, obviously the Grecian Empire didn't bring stars out of heaven, okay? And so there's an aspect that's a there and then, dealing with the Grecian Empire where he's casting down to the ground stars, some kind of figurative meaning to this as far as taking out armies or something like that, right? Or bringing people with him kind of aspect. But this, I believe, actually more so shows us the future, because go to Revelation chapter 12. Revelation chapter 12. So we see that it cast down some of the host and of the stars to the ground. So like I said, I do believe it does apply to the Grecian, the end of the Grecian Empire and dealing with Antiochus, Epiphanes, and all this stuff. But I more so see this tying in with Revelation chapter 12 here, actually. In Revelation chapter 12, verse 3, it says, and there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his heads. And his tail drew the third part of the, stars of heaven, and did cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman which was ready to be delivered, to devour her child as soon as it was born. So we see the dragon with the 7 head, 10 horns, right, which also pictures the Antichrist. But you think of like that Babylonian, kingdom of 7 heads, and how he's basically taking down the stars of heaven, some of them. Notice it says he cast down some of the host of the stars, and it says a third, right? So it's some of them. It's not all of them. And so I do see that more so leaning towards the end, right? Because we see that's obviously talking about how the devil took a third of the angels with him to be a part of his army, right? And go to Daniel chapter 8 again. So keep your hand in Daniel chapter 8, obviously. And we'll be going to other places to kind of show the significance of it. Daniel 8 and verse 11. So it says in verse 11, "Yea, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down." So we see here that this little horn also magnifies himself even to the prince of the host. We'll see even later on that it's clearly talking about he's magnifying himself to God. Okay? Go to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. Again, everything in the New Testament is clearly after, way after the Grecian Empire, right? So there's no doubt that what we're seeing here in Daniel 8 and we'll see in Daniel 11 as well is definitely future events. Like, it's going to be dealing with future events. So for anybody to say, well, that's all in Greece, that's you'd have to literally be blind to the New Testament on what it teaches on this, okay? But I also don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater and say that there's no application to Greece, the Grecian Empire, when it came to that, okay? It's kind of like when you look at that a virgin shall conceive. Obviously, that's going on with a story that's being told, and obviously when we're dealing with that, what's the true fulfillment? Jesus was born of the Virgin Mary. But you could also maybe see the fact that, hey, a virgin's going to get married and have a child, and, kind of taking it's a little more loosely when you're looking at it that way, right? But there is a physical application as far as something that's going to happen, like a king being born or something like that back in that time. But the real fulfillment is Jesus. Does that make sense? Like, there's kind of a shadow of what was said, but it's really meant for the future. And so in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 3, it says, "Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he, as God, sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God." So when it says that he magnified himself even to the prince of the host, you can definitely see how it's talking about the Antichrist, the man of sin, the son of perdition, which is to come, right? And this is talking about the day of the Lord, is not going to come until the man of sin, there's a falling away first, and then the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition. Who's going to do this? This is also, that verse is why I believe there will be a temple of some sort, okay, when the Antichrist comes. Because it says that he's going to sit in the temple of God saying that he is God, okay? And listen, if this is maybe supposed to be more figurative or something like that, okay. But I personally take this literally, that there's going to be a temple, and I'm going to get into this with preterism because that destroys this also destroys preterism. But I want you to see the dual fulfillment. Grecian Empire, end of the world. Same things that are going on. One's more of a shadow fulfillment with Antiochus Epiphanes or whoever you want to say it is. If you're like, it's not Antiochus, whatever. It's somebody that did this back then. And then the true fulfillment is when it happens in the future, which hasn't happened yet. But going back to Daniel chapter 8, this is really the vision that I want you to see. So that stuff is kind of, interesting. It's talking about this horn, this king that's going to come out of the one of these four kingdoms that split off from Alexander the Great here. And he's going to do all this stuff that's really similar to the Antichrist. But then you have in verse 13, this number, this prophecy of stuff that's going to happen. It gives you a timeline. So here's our first real big timeline dealing with end times prophecy. So in verse 13 there it says, "Then I heard one saint speaking, and another saint said unto that certain saint which spake, How long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice and the transgression of desolation, to get both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden under foot? And he said unto me, Unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed." This is very interesting. I love this timeline here, because listen, this timeline honestly isn't super necessary because we have so many other timelines that'll give us that structure over there. But this timeline destroys preterism, okay? Because it puts a timeline on how long the sanctuary is going to be trodden underfoot. Preterism, it's still being trodden underfoot after 2,000 years, okay? So, but what do you see in there? You see, it's not just the trotting underfoot. It's not just the abomination of desolation, right? It says the daily sacrifice, the abomination, or the transgression of desolation, which would be the abomination of desolation. I believe it's the same thing. The sanctuary being trodden underfoot, and the sanctuary being cleansed. So basically what it's saying is that from when the daily sacrifice, I believe what's being said here, because if you were looking at 2,300 days, that's not quite 7 years, right? That's less. It's like just over 6 years. I don't care if you're using a 360 calendar or 365. It's around just over 6 years, okay? So what I believe this is stating here is that, and you may wonder about this too, as far as in the future, they're not doing daily sacrifices right now. So at some point, they're going to have to start doing that again, for the daily sacrifice to be taken away and for him to set up the abomination of desolation, if this is going to be taken super literally as far as what's going to happen in the end. Now back then, obviously it can make sense that they've been doing daily sacrifices and therefore they just stop it, right? In the Old Testament, that makes sense, right? They're doing it, and then it just stops, okay? But I believe this number is actually more so dealing with the future and the fact that it's showing you that that 7-year period is going to start with wars, rumors of wars, all that stuff. There's going to be a temple or tabernacle that's going to be built, and at almost, not even a year into that 7-year period, they're going to start doing sacrifices, daily sacrifices. And then in the midst of that week is when the abomination of desolation happens. That's when they stop the daily sacrifice, right? It says, and it talks about that in other places, that he's going to take away the daily sacrifice. And then he's going to trod underfoot the sanctuary in the city until it's cleansed. Okay? And so I know this is deep, but basically what this is saying is that it's almost just over 6 years that all that takes place. And so basically at the very end of everything is when it's cleansed. And then you backtrack, and then you're almost at the beginning of that 7-year period. Okay, but not quite, meaning that it's not going to start off, or that I don't believe that they're going to be doing sacrifices before the 7 year starts. Does that make sense? It's going to be started. When you see the daily sacrifices, you may be thinking, okay, this may be it. Now, I'll say this, a caveat to that. Maybe they start trying to do that, and hasn't started yet. And then they destroy that temple or something like that. They destroy that little tabernacle, and it's not really the true one that's going to be done, okay? I'm not saying that they couldn't. So that's why when it says when you see the abomination of desolation, that's when you know, okay? So it doesn't say when you start seeing them doing daily sacrifices. So, but all I'd say is that this passage destroys preterism. Now go to Luke chapter 21. Luke chapter 21, I'm going to show you why that's the case. Because preterists, you say, what's preterism? Preterism basically states, or what they believe, is that everything in Revelation has already happened back in like 70 AD. Right? When the temple was destroyed, that was the abomination of desolation. And then all the vials and trumpets were done back then, or were in the vials and trumpets or something like that. But they pretty much believe that we're in the millennial reign right now. Like amillennialism. Have you ever heard that term? Amillennialism basically is stating like we are in his kingdom right now. He's really ruling and reigning, and we're supposed to be like basically. That's why you'll see Jeff Durbin's one of these guys. Okay, and just put aside his views on Calvinism, amillennialism. That's why he's basically going up to these courts, and his big prerogative is like to get rid of abortion, which I'm not against getting rid of abortion, but he literally believes that Christ is ruling and reigning in this earth right now. That's ridiculous. Okay? Not to mention it's 1,000 years that he's supposed to reign, and it's been 2,000 years since then, right? So, that's weird. But all that to say is that that's what amillennialism is. Basically, you have preterism, where all that stuff in Revelation about the seals and the vials, and the trumpets, that's already happened to them. Okay. Now that falls apart in many ways, but one of the big things that they'll go to Luke chapter 21. Go to Luke chapter 21 and verse 20. One thing you need to realize about Luke 21, which I didn't realize for a long time, is Luke chapter 21, when Jesus is talking here, is not the same as, this is not the Olivet Discourse. When you read it carefully, this is actually before, this is all spoken in the temple. What you see in Luke 21, Matthew 24 and Mark 13 are actually when he goes to the Mount of Olives. Okay, that's where you have the Olivet Discourse, phrase. So when he's saying in Luke 21, I believe is talking a lot about what's going to happen to Jerusalem being destroyed and all that stuff. And there is a lot of parallels to that as far as Jerusalem being destroyed and what's going to happen in the future. But that's why you see things that are a little more cryptic when you're looking at Luke 21 and then when you're looking at Matthew 24, because Matthew 24 is more so pointed towards end times, whereas Luke 21 is kind of answering that question as far as when's this stuff going to happen with the temple, because he just said that not one stone is going to be left upon another, which really did happen at 70 AD. That really did happen. The Jerusalem was decimated, the temple was decimated. And so Luke 21 is dealing with that, but you also see the Son of Man coming in the clouds in Luke 21. So you can't take it too far and say, well, it's all just talking about 70 AD, because when did Jesus come in the clouds back then? Okay. And so in Luke 21, I do believe that there is kind of a dual fulfillment a little bit there, but it never calls this the abomination of desolation. I want that to be clear, okay? When it says this, it talks about the desolation and stuff like that, but it never says that when Jerusalem's being destroyed that that's the abomination of desolation, okay? It parallels it, but it's not perfect, okay? In Luke 21 verse 20, it says, "And when ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let them which are in the midst of it depart out, and let not them that are in the countries enter therein too. For these be the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. But woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days, for there shall be great distress in the land, and wrath upon this people. And they shall fall by the edge of the sword, and shall be led away captive into all nations. And Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled." So there is definitely application dealing with what happened with 70 AD, as far as obviously armies came in. Titus of Rome came in and completely annihilated Jerusalem. I'll say this. This is why that 2300 number doesn't fit. Tell me when that temple was cleansed. Right? Was it ever cleansed? It's still completely decimated. Okay? Meaning that it wouldn't make sense that number would fit with 70 AD. Because at the end of that vision, it's cleansed. Okay? When you deal with end times, which we're going to see in Revelation chapter 11, go to Revelation chapter 11, it doesn't say that they're destroying the temple. It says they're trodden underfoot the city and the sanctuary. It's basically saying the court and the sanctuary and all that stuff. But it's going to be cleansed. For it to be cleansed, it has to still be there. Does that make sense? So in 70 AD, it was completely gone. And so it was trodden underfoot. And it was, desolated, right? But there's no cleansing that's going on there. And I don't see anything, and maybe I'm just not a history buff, I don't see anything about abomination of desolation or anything like that being done with Titus and Rome when they destroyed it. And you can say, well, there was a 7-year war. Okay. I think it can parallel it a little bit, but I think the biggest dual fulfillment is dealing with the Grecian Empire and dealing with end times. Okay. And there is kind of some similarities with what happened with Jerusalem where it was desolated. But again, I think the big problem here is that nothing's being cleansed. Okay. And it still hasn't been cleansed. It's still completely decimated. Now, in Revelation chapter 11, this is where this comes down. Now, when it says that until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled, that's where, if you're going to say that happened in 70 AD, that's a lot of time, because the times of the Gentiles is still going on. Okay? And what I'm going to show you is that the times of the Gentiles isn't fulfilled until the 7th trumpet sounds. Okay? And in Revelation chapter 11, first I want to show you this. It talks about the trotting underfoot or the treading underfoot. And that phrase is actually only, the treading underfoot is really only mentioned in Daniel 8, Luke 21, and Revelation 11. So, that being said, those are the places you should probably look to. If you're going to see, well, what's this talking about with the treading underfoot? And so, Revelation chapter 11, verse 1, it says, "And there was given me a reed like unto a rod, and the angel stood, saying, Rise and measure the temple of God, and the altar, and them that worship therein. But the court which is without the temple leave out, and measure it not. for it is given unto the Gentiles, and the holy city shall they tread underfoot 42 months. So it gives you a timeline. This cannot be 70 AD. That wouldn't make any sense, because 42 months have come and gone a long time ago. Okay? And, I don't care what you change that number to, but remember, we were seeing 42 months, and then notice what it says right after that in verse 3. And I will give unto my 2 witnesses, and they shall, I give power unto my 2 witnesses, and they shall prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. That's talking about the same event. So when this trotting underfoot happens, you're going to have the 2 witnesses witnessing there for that same amount of time. So you're dealing with what? 3.5 years of this trotting underfoot. Do you see how that completely annihilates what's happening there? And then that 2,300 days, that's also a time frame that cannot fit with it happening in 70 AD. That all fits with this, meaning that in that 7-year period, you're going to have the daily sacrifice, the abomination of desolation. It's going to be trodden underfoot for 42 months. So out of that 2,300 days, 1,260 is being trodden underfoot. Does that make sense? And at the end of that is when it's cleansed. So when you see these witnesses, they're during that time, and they die right before the 7th trumpet sounds. I want you to see that. Go down in verse 11 there. Revelation 11, verse 11. And I know this is deep. I'm going to really try to dig this in. This is really the meat of what we're trying to get to, is this 2,300 days and what this is talking about and how it fits in with the end times prophecy. And really, I don't really care how it fit in with Antiochus Epiphanes, meaning that I believe it did, okay? I believe that that 2,300 days fit with what was going on back then. But really, this is more so dealing with what we're dealing with in the future, okay? This is, I would believe, the actual fulfillment of it in the future, whereas that was more of a shadow and kind of paralleling what was going to happen in the future. And so in verse 11 there it says, and after 3 days and a half the Spirit of life from God entered into them, and they stood upon their feet, and great fear fell upon them which saw them. So if you know the story, they're killed by the Antichrist. 3.5 days later, they come back to life. And it says, and they heard a great voice from heaven saying unto them, come up hither. And they ascended up to heaven in a cloud, and their enemies beheld them. Notice this in verse 13. In the same hour. Okay, so when they died 3.5 days later, they go up into heaven. The same hour, this is what happens. Was there a great earthquake, and the 10th part of the city fell, and in the earthquake were slain of men 7,000, and the remnant were affrighted, and gave glory to the God of heaven. And then it says, verse 14, the second woe was past. So what did that mark? The end of the 6th trumpet. Okay, so the first woe was the 5th trumpet, second woe was the 6th trumpet, and then the third woe was the 7th trumpet. Okay, and it says, the second woe is past, and behold, the third woe cometh quickly, meaning that it's about to sound right now. So at the very end of their ministry, what happens? The 7th trumpet sounds. Does that make sense? In verse 15, and the 7th angel sounded, and there were great voices in heaven saying, the kingdoms of this world are become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. Now go back to Revelation chapter 10. And I'm going to show you these verses, and then I'm going to try to just explain it very simply. Meaning that what we see here is that in the end times, you're going to have the abomination of desolation that happens. And then that city, Jerusalem, is going to be trodden underfoot for 3.5 years. At the end of the 3.5 years, the trumpet's going to sound, for the 7th trumpet's going to sound, and that's when all the kingdoms of the world are become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ. That means that it's no longer the beast kingdom. It's no longer any of the Gentiles' kingdoms. No other nation is ruling at that time. Christ is ruling. And then you're going to have the Battle of Armageddon, where obviously he annihilates the beast and his army, right? But in chapter 10 here, there's something that's said that's very interesting, and it's a little cryptic, but if you understand what's being said here, I think it really makes a lot of sense. In Revelation 10, verse 5, we have this angel that's going to give kind of this vision to John. And it says in verse 5, and the angel which I saw stand upon the sea and upon the earth lifted up his hand to heaven, and swear by him that liveth forever and ever, and who created heaven and the things that therein are, and the earth and the things that therein are, and the sea and the things which are therein, that there should be time no longer. But in the days of the voice of the 7th angel, when he shall begin to sound, the mystery of God shall be finished, as he hath declared to his servants, the prophets. So what he's saying here is that there's going to, it says at the beginning, when that seventh angel begins to sound that trumpet, that's when time's going to be no longer. What time? Well, we know it's not just time in general, because we're going to have a 1,000-year reign of Christ. So that wouldn't make any sense, right? So it's not just like time's gone, there's no more sense of time, okay? There's a certain time that's being accomplished. Go to Romans chapter 11. Romans chapter 11. I believe you're dealing with the times of the Gentiles, okay? So basically, you had the Old Testament, which was really kind of the times of Israel, if you're going to look at it as far as that's the nation that God is choosing to basically fulfill his will, preach the gospel. The New Testament, what do we have? You just have all nations. And what is another word for Gentiles? Nations. That's literally what, if you look in other places, when it says Gentiles, it means nations. Now, that means that in the New Testament, you have multiple nations and multiple kingdoms as far as, preaching the gospel, doing what you're supposed to be doing. So that's why I believe it's called the times of the Gentiles, as far as that's going, because no longer is Israel recognized as being God's nation. Okay? So put that in your replacement theology pipe and smoke it. It's just the way it is. Israel was replaced by the holy nation, which is made up of what? Barbarian, Scythian, Jew, Greek, everybody. Okay? So that's why you had the times of the Gentiles, why you'd see it that way. But in Romans chapter 11, verse 25, and that's what the whole chapter is talking about, is about Israel and then the other nations, right? And how the nations are being grafted in. You can be grafted in if you believe and all this other stuff. In Romans 11, verse 25, this may make sense now when you look at this verse where it says, "For I would not, brethren, that ye should be ignorant of this mystery, lest ye should be wise in your own conceits, that blindness in part has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in." Now, when you were looking at Luke 21, and it says that it's going to be trodden down to the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled, when you look at Revelation chapter 11, where does that fit in? When's the times of the Gentiles going to be filled? When that seventh trumpet sounds, right? And here it says that Israel is going to be blinded until the times of the Gentiles, or the fullness of the Gentiles, be come in. So that means Israel, the physical nation of Israel, is blinded until the seventh trumpet sounds. And why is it not blinded after that? Because Jesus Christ is ruling and reigning from Israel. That's why. They're no longer blinded at that point. But until that point, when Jesus is ruling and reigning, they're blinded. And the times of the Gentiles is going on until that point. And so when you look at Revelation chapter 10, it says there shall be time no longer, but in the days of the voice of the seventh trumpet, when he shall begin to sound, the mystery of God should be finished. What did it say about the fullness of the Gentiles, or about Israel being blinded? I would not that you should be ignorant of what? This mystery. Okay? And I know this is deep, okay, when you're dealing with this, but this really destroys preterism, because they don't have a leg to stand on when you look at 2,300 days, that it's going to be trodden underfoot and then be cleansed, right? And then in Revelation chapter 11, it says 42 months, or 1,260 days, until what? The seventh trumpet sounds. And I believe that's the cleansing, right? That's the cleansing, is when that seventh trumpet sounds, and the kingdoms of our Lord have become the kingdoms of the kingdoms of this world. Notice the kingdoms of this world. What would another word be for that? Gentiles. The nations of this world have become the kingdoms of our world, of our Lord and of his Christ. So the times of the Gentiles have come to an end, because now it's all Christ's. It's his kingdom, which we see over and over again in Daniel chapter 7, dealing with, at the end of all this stuff, with the Antichrist, what's the end game? That we get the kingdom. That he gets the kingdom. That's the end game. And Daniel's vision, Nebuchadnezzar's vision in chapter 2, what's the end game? This stone comes out and crushes him at this image at the feet, and that rock, or that stone, becomes a mountain and becomes the nation of the world, right? And so, when you're looking at this, and you say, well, I don't care, I don't know about preterism or whatever, that's fine, okay? But what I'm saying is that is a belief out there that this has already happened. And I'll probably get into this in chapter 9, when you're dealing with the 1 week that he confirms his covenant, and they're going to say, well, that happened back in 70 AD. But I'd really like to see how they answer these verses in Revelation chapter 11 and Luke 21, the only places that the trotting underfoot is even mentioned, by the way. And so I hope that makes sense. If you have any questions about that specific spot there, dealing with that 2,300 days, and I kind of did a chart on that, but when you look at that chart over there, you're going to see that 2,300 days. And you can kind of see over there, you have this mark that's kind of starting a little further into the start of the 7 years, and then it goes all the way to the end. That's that 2,300 days, okay? And it stops at the seventh trumpet sounding. And then there's going to be another 30 days. Well, what's going on there? You have the Battle of Armageddon. You have the marriage supper of the Lamb, which is not eating biscuits and gravy, by the way. It's actually a battle. It's a war. It's where the fowl of the air are going to feast on flesh. Okay, so there's going to be a supper, but it's not the supper you're thinking of. Okay, but then it goes into the 1,000-year reign. Okay, but going back to Daniel chapter 8, and I'll probably try to hit on that some more. We'll be going into Matthew 24 in our Wednesday night series, and I'll be hitting on end time stuff and kind of showing you that difference between Luke 21 and Matthew 24. And so I don't want to discount that there is some kind of parallel in 70 AD, but I don't believe it's as strong as the parallel with the Grecian Empire and the end of the world. I think that's like lock and step, like that's exactly kind of what's going on. Where 70 AD is kind of a shadow a little bit, dealing with how Jerusalem's going to be desolated, but there's no cleansing that's going on. And I don't believe there's any abomination of desolation that happened, like where they set up an image and they're trying to get them to worship that image. But in Daniel chapter 8 and verse 16, I want you to see this too, because I want you to know that this vision is, I believe, going more so talking about the last, dealing with the last times, dealing with the last days, dealing with what's going to happen at the very end. So in Daniel 8 and verse 16, it says, "And I heard a man's voice between the banks of Ulai, which called and said, Gabriel, make this man to understand the vision. So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was afraid and fell upon my face. But he said unto me, Understand, O son of man, for at the time of the end shall be the vision." Notice in verse 19, and it says, "And he said, Behold, I will make thee know what shall be in the last end of the indignation. For at the time appointed, the end shall be." So notice how I keep saying the end, the last, the end. And what are we in? The last days, the last times. And so I believe the true fulfillment of that 2,300 days is what's to come. Okay? Did it shadow fulfillment of that happen back, and this we're dealing with around 100 and some BC. Okay? If you want to know a timeline as far as when that happened, when that supposedly happened with the Maccabean Revolution, and that is something that happened. Whether all that information's right, I would, like I said, when you're reading the Apocrypha with that, I would take that with a big grain of salt. When you're reading history, you got to take that with a grain of salt. But it doesn't mean it's all wrong. I mean, if you find coins with Antiochus Epiphanes' face and his name on it, then there's probably some truth to the fact that he was there. Okay, and what does Antiochus Epiphanes mean? God manifest. He surnamed himself Epiphanes, which means manifest, right? And so he literally was saying he was God manifested, which is what is the Antichrist saying? I'm God, sitting in the temple, showing himself that he is God. Okay, so do I think Antiochus Epiphanes was the Antichrist? No, I believe he was basically a foreshadowing, kind of a picture of that, just like Judas is a foreshadowing of the Antichrist, right? He's the son of perdition, but he's not the Antichrist that's to come, right? I don't believe he's going to be the Antichrist reincarnated, right? Some people, I think, believe that, right? That when he comes back from the bottomless pit, it's actually Judas, okay? I don't think that. I don't believe that. But I do believe he's a picture of the Antichrist, right? He's going to be possessed with the devil and all these different things that are going to happen and obviously go against Christ. Judas was kind of the Antichrist at Jesus' first coming, and then you're going to have the Antichrist at Jesus' second coming. Okay, so you have all these parallels that work together. But go to Daniel chapter 8. I do want to show you a little bit of the parallel in Daniel 8 and 11 before we get to Daniel 11. But I also want you to see also the parallel that when you're dealing with this shadow fulfillment with the Grecian Empire, it's interesting because you're coming at the latter end of their kingdom, right? It's coming at the very end. So we've already seen Alexander the Great, then it's split off into these 4 kingdoms, and it's at the latter end of those kingdoms. Because if you know history with the Roman Empire, when you're at like 130 BC, you're getting into where Rome's going to be taking control. Okay, and basically after Antiochus Epiphanes, what I've been reading in history and stuff like that is that the kingdoms pretty much were disintegrating after that. And it became where Rome steps in. And that's where Jesus' day comes in, is that Rome was the superpower. And Rome was the superpower for a few hundred years after that until they finally fell too. Okay? And so, but in Daniel chapter 8, I want you to see that portion of it. So when it says in Daniel 8:23, and in the latter time of their kingdom. So what kingdom? Those 4 kingdoms, right? The latter time of their kingdom, when transgressors are come to the full, a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences shall stand up. So you kind of think of, well, okay, it says at the end this shall be, and at the time of the end. You can definitely see how that parallels to the Grecian Empire. Because it's kind of at the end of the Grecian Empire, this stuff's going to go down. But then you see the time of the end, where like the end, right? The end of the world, this stuff's going to go down. So you see how it's kind of dual even in meaning with when this is going to happen. The end of the Grecian Empire, the end of the world, the end of the actual final kingdom. Daniel chapter 11, verse 5. And when we get to Daniel 11, I'll show you that it's clear that Daniel 11 is pretty much Daniel 8 with a lot more information. Okay, so Daniel 11, verse 5, it says, and the king of the south shall be strong, and one of his princes, and he shall be strong above him and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion, and in the end of years they shall join themselves together. So notice that, and I just kind of want to stop with that. I don't want to get too far into Daniel 11. But when you're dealing with what's being said mostly in Daniel 11, because that's at the very beginning of the chapter there, you're dealing at the end of those 4 kingdoms, okay? You're dealing with the kind of the end of the Seleucid kingdom, the end of the Ptolemy kingdom, but you're dealing with those kingdoms, but it's kind of at the end of their kingdoms before it gets into the Roman Empire. But you can also see how that applies to the end of the actual world, and how that parallels. And go to, you're still in Daniel chapter 11. This is where, you think about at the end of the kingdom in verse 21, it says, and in his estate shall stand up a vile person to whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom, but he shall come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. Go to Daniel chapter 8 and verse 25. So he says he shall come in peaceably. He's a vile person, right? Obviously the Antichrist is vile. But in Daniel 8, verse 25, it says, through his policy also he shall cause craft to prosper in his hand, and he shall magnify himself in his heart, and by peace shall destroy many. He shall also stand up against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without hand. So you can see how this applies with that vile person in Daniel 11, 21, I believe is what we're dealing with when you're dealing with Antiochus Epiphanes and he comes in and sets up this image. Basically, when you look at the history of it, what he was trying to do is Hellenize, not hell like hell beneath, but Hellenize like the Hellenistic period, right? Dealing with Greek mythology, Zeus, all that stuff. He was trying to Hellenize kingdoms, and he was basically trying to de-Judaize, whereas you had the Hebrew roots who was trying to Judaize people. So he was trying, that's why he takes away the sacrifices and sets up this image of Zeus or whatever, and he's trying to get them to worship their gods, okay? And so that's kind of what you get in with that. But again, when you're dealing with this vile person that was back in the Grecian Empire, you definitely see how that's really more so going to be talking about the Antichrist coming in peaceably, right? Is it not peace? Like he's going to come in and listen, war a lot of times is predicated under the guise of having peace. A one world government is going to be under the guise of having peace. Give up all your rights under the guise of peace and security, right? And so this guy's going to come in peaceably. But I want to show you another parallel. Remember I was saying with Assyria, go to Nahum chapter 1. Because you say, well, I don't know if I'm buying all this stuff with the Grecian Empire. Well, I think it's hard to overlook because it's very clear that it's coming out of the Grecian Empire. But think about this with Nineveh and the Assyrians. So Nineveh was the capital city of Assyria, which I believe was one of those 7 heads that was broken. That 5 are fallen, 1 is, and 1 is yet to come. And so one of those ones that's fallen would be the Assyrians. In Nahum chapter 1 and verse 11, notice what it says. It says, there is one come out of thee that imagineth evil against the Lord, a wicked counselor. Notice verse 14. And the Lord hath given a commandment concerning thee, that no more of thy name be sown out of the house of thy gods. Will I cut off the graven image and the molten image? I will make thy grave, for thou art vile. So you can kind of see even in the Assyrian, when Nineveh was taken out by God, there was this vile person that I believe was the king at the time that was taken out. Now, was he the Antichrist? No, but he is a picture of the Antichrist. And when you see Nineveh, it talks about how that woe unto that bloody city, and there's a lot of parallels to what's said about the Babylon in the future, and even the Babylon that was destroyed in the past, and how it parallels with Nineveh. Nineveh is very much getting the same judgment that Babylon of the Chaldeans got, and what the Babylon in the future is going to get. Okay? And so there's a lot of parallels or dual fulfillments or multiple fulfillments of the same thing. But then you have what's going to actually happen. Okay, what's the main thing that's being prophesied? The Antichrist and the tribulation which the world has never seen. Okay? So all these things that have happened, it still doesn't touch what's going to happen in the future. Okay? And going back to Daniel chapter 8, dealing with this little horn. And I'm really just kind of going line upon line through this. And again, if you have any questions or anything's confusing about this, just let me know. I'll try to explain it a little better. But it is a deep subject. I was going to bring out the board, and show the timelines, but it would have really just been one timeline, so I don't know how great that would have been. When I did a whole Daniel timeline thing, I was showing all of the timelines. So maybe when we get to Daniel 12, there's a lot more timelines than that. Maybe I'll bust out the old whiteboard and show that to you guys. But if you get a chance, look at the chart over there, because it is on there, dealing with that 2,300 days. But Daniel chapter 8 and verse 24, it says, and his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. And he shall destroy wonderfully, and shall prosper and practice, and shall destroy the mighty and the holy people. Now, I believe this happened back in that time period during the Grecian Empire, but I believe it more so is picturing what's going to happen in the future. Go to Revelation chapter 13. Revelation chapter 13. What's being said here is just quoting Revelation when you're dealing with the Antichrist that's going to come. See, the Jews are going to say, well, all that stuff happened in Greece, the Antichrist, the abomination. They're going to say basically everything in Daniel, that's already happened, Well, Jesus said that when you see the abomination and desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, so when they say, well, that's already happened, that's not going to happen in the future, they're calling Jesus a liar. Which obviously they're doing that anyway because they don't believe he's the Christ. But if you say, well, man, if they just saw Daniel and how much that fit, with Jesus and all this, they're not going to see. They're going to basically somehow say, well, that's already happened. They will completely negate that there's a dual fulfillment in the abomination and desolation. They'll say, well, that happened in Antiochus Epiphanes, which is not false, I don't believe, but it doesn't negate the fact that it's going to happen again, and that's really the true fulfillment of it. Okay, so in Daniel chapter 8 and verse 24. We see that but not by his own power, right? He's going to be mighty, but not by his own power. Notice in Revelation 13, verse 2, it says, and the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion. And the dragon, what? Gave him his power and his seat and great authority. So he was mighty and he had power, but it wasn't by his own. It was by the devil, right? The devil gave him his power and his seat of authority. And you know what? People are always like, oh, God put Obama in office. God put Trump in office. Did he put the Antichrist in office? Who gave him his power here? It wasn't God. The Calvinists, the whole God puts everything in order and everything he does is by him. The devil did this. The devil's going to put the Antichrist in power. But also I believe that what we're going to see is that there are demonic forces, devils in the background, if you will, that are giving power to a lot of these kingdoms. Okay? So the devil, the dragon, is going to be giving the Antichrist power. But what we're going to see, especially when we get to Daniel 10, we're going to be dealing with that there's devils that are out there that are trying to prop up kingdoms. And there's wickedness in high places. Okay, meaning that there's a lot of demonic stuff that's going on up in the higher ups in the kingdoms that are basically ruling. And it's not, and basically the man is just a puppet of what the devils are trying to do with these kingdoms, right? But notice in verse 7 there, because we saw that not only it was not by his own power in Daniel 8:24, but it says he shall destroy the mighty and the holy people. Notice in verse 7 of Revelation 13, and it was given unto him to make war with the saints and to overcome them, and power was given him over all kindreds and tongues and nations. So you see how it falls lock and step with the Antichrist that's going to come? But I don't believe I don't think that negates that happened back then, right? Because if you read the story about what happened back then, basically he came in and he was killing anybody that didn't want to worship his gods, right? And he was given power, but it wasn't by his own power. Like these different things that you could definitely see with that king that was back in that day. And then also going to Daniel chapter 8 and verse 24. Notice what it says, and we already read this verse, but at the end of that verse it says, he shall also stand up against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without hand. Go to Revelation chapter 19. Revelation chapter 19. Now, being broken without hand, I was reading on how Antiochus Epiphanes died. Okay? Now, in some history it says that he died, he was in a war campaign and he died, but it doesn't say that he died in battle. Okay? Even in that modern history. In the Maccabees, it says that he got so depressed. This is paraphrasing it. But he got so depressed because he found out that, the Jews, there was Judah Maccabee that revolted, and they took back over Jerusalem, and they cleansed the temple, right? And he got so depressed about that he got sick. He made himself sick, and then he died. Okay? And so, yeah, he died without hand. Either way you look at it, I don't know how he died. But he got sick, okay, is what it says in the Maccabees. But dying without hand would suggest that he didn't die by battle, right? He didn't die in combat, okay? He died from something that was more of a natural cause death or something, right? He didn't take his own life, I don't think. I think he just, what it says there is he got so depressed. I think it's hilarious, right? I was reading, I was just like, if this is true, it's just funny, right? He just got so depressed. He's like, oh man, they didn't want to follow my gods. I'm so mad, I'm so sad about that. Now I'm going to go, I'm just going to make myself sick and die, Anyway, so, but all that to say is that this obviously, whether any of that's true, it doesn't really matter, right? I'll say this, that I do believe that however that king died, if it's Antiochus Epiphanes, he died without hand. But it more so is picturing the Antichrist now. He's going to die, okay? So notice what it says in Revelation 19, because it also says that he's going to stand up against the Prince of Princes. Well, that actually happens, the Battle of Armageddon, right? It says in Revelation 19:19, and I saw the beast and the kings of the earth and their armies gathered together to make war against him that sat on the horse and against his army. And so there, what do you see? Him gathering himself against, standing up against the Prince of Princes. And notice this in verse 20. And the beast was taken, and with him the false prophet that wrought miracles before him, with which he deceived them that had received the mark of the beast, and them that worshipped his image. These both were cast alive into a lake of fire burning with brimstone. So did he get stabbed through or anything? No, he literally took them and cast him into the lake of fire, body, soul, everything, right? And just threw him in. So he was destroyed without hand. And you say, well, did he do it with his hand? Well, notice what it says in the next verse. It says, and the remnant were slain with the sword of him that sat upon the horse, which sword proceeded out of his mouth, and all the fowls were filled with their flesh. So he spoke the word, and they were cast into the lake of fire. That's what happened. The sword, obviously the word of God, right? The sword, the two-edged sword. For the word of God is quick and powerful and sharper than any two-edged sword. And it talks about the sword that proceeded out of his mouth. It's obviously talking about his word, right? So he spoke the word. They were cast into the lake of fire. There, the Antichrist was broken without hand, right? And then just ending Daniel chapter 8. This is something I didn't really mention in the series here, but it's important to know. when we're going through this series, we're dealing with a cryptic book. Okay, when we're going through this is not the revealed portion of prophecy. That's why I'm going to Revelation. That's why I'm going to other places to just show you this is what it's talking about, okay? Notice in Daniel 8, in verse 26, it says, "In the vision of the evening and the morning which was told is true, wherefore shut thou up the vision, for it shall be for many days. And I, Daniel, fainted and was sick certain days. Afterward I rose up and did the king's business, and I was astonished at the vision, but none understood it." So he's basically, God's saying, seal up this vision. It's not going to be for many days. Now go to Revelation 22. Revelation 22. So the mistake is to go into Daniel and thinking that's your marker, that's basically the foundation of Bible prophecy. It's not. Revelation is the foundation. And if you want to know what Daniel was talking about, you need Revelation. Okay? To go the other way around, you're going to fall into a ditch somewhere. Okay? You have to take Revelation and make Daniel fit it. Okay? And it does fit. But to go the other way around and say, well, this is what I think about Daniel, now I'm going to try to make Revelation fit that, that's backwards. Because notice what it says in Revelation 22:10. "And he saith unto me, seal not the sayings of the prophecy of this book, for the time is at hand." So notice he's saying in Daniel, seal it up. It's a sealed book. But then Revelation is saying, don't seal this up. You need to know this. And just in the word revelation, what do you see? Revealed. So Revelation is the revealed prophecy. Daniel's the sealed. And basically, if you remember when it talks about something being sealed, it's something that you can't understand and stuff like that. And even at the end of this chapter, what does it say? But none understood it. Okay? But we can understand it. Why? Because I'm taking you to Revelation and showing you exactly what's spelled out about it. Because if you were just to look at this as far as this king of fierce countenance and all this stuff, you'd be like, what in the world are you talking about? When does this take place? What's going on? When you look at Revelation, you're like, oh, that makes perfect sense. It's going to be trodden underfoot. 7 trumps going to sound. That's going to be the cleansing. And then you're going to have him basically standing up against the Prince of Princes. He's going to be broken without hand. That's the Battle of Armageddon. And boom, you're done. That's the end of the vision, right? It's pretty simple when you look at Revelation. And so that's Daniel chapter 8. And, again, like I said, that 2,300 days is really kind of the crux of what you're looking at in this chapter. If there's something to hone in on, because a lot of the chapters dealing with the ram with 2 horns and the he-goat, that's pretty much self-explanatory, right? Yeah, it just spells it out. It just says what it is, right? But after that is when you get into that little horn and understanding dual fulfillment. I think once you understand dual fulfillment, it'll help you really understand Bible prophecy and understand, okay, this applied, like Elijah coming, applied to John the Baptist, but it's also going to apply in the future with the 2 witnesses. And just different things that are kind of a dual fulfillment, that it applied in Jesus' first coming, but it's also going to apply in his second coming. It applied in the Grecian Empire, but it's also going to apply in the very last kingdom. Okay? And that's what you see here. So I think that helps to understand and be like, okay, well, where does this stop as far as what had already happened and what hasn't happened? When you get into that little horn, it's all about what's going to happen too. It already happened, but it's also all about what's going to happen in the future. Okay? And so we'll have a couple chapters break in between this and Daniel 11. Daniel 11 is probably going to be the most intense as far as like cryptic and trying to figure it out. And listen, we're not going to get into every little detail because I don't know every little detail, right? When it comes to, well, who's the daughter that's being married, and who's the daughter of women that's being given to this, okay? Listen, there's just some things that obviously happened back then and I'm sure has a significance in the future. But we may not even know until that comes, right? We may be looking back and be like, oh, that's what Daniel meant about that, and this was going on and all that stuff. And when it comes to speculation, I'm going to stay away from that. Okay, I'm going to stick to what the Bible actually says and fitting those pieces together. And then the fun part is that you can look at those other things and say, well, I wonder what this could be. I wonder how this could fit. And that's the fun part about Bible prophecy because it hasn't happened yet. And so let's end with a word of prayer to Heavenly Father. Lord, we thank you for this evening and thank you for the soul winners here at this church, and just pray that you'd would lead us to people that would get saved, and Lord, just help us to be encouraged in the fact that we know that people are going to get saved in the future, and Lord, just pray that your name would be glorified through that. I do pray that you'd help us to understand Daniel. I know it's a it's a sealed book. It's something that is more difficult to understand, but I pray that you'd help us to understand it, and Lord, to ultimately know it for the future as far as how it pertains to us. And Lord, we love you, and pray also in Jesus Christ's name. Amen.